This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. It's a new academic year, and that means it's time for one of my favorite EWA Radio traditions, back-to-school story ideas. Last week, we talked with Scott Jasic of Inside Higher Ed about what's looming for colleges and universities. Be sure to catch up with that episode if you haven't already. And today, we're joined by the newly minted senior reporter for Chalkbeat covering national education issues, Kalyn Belsha. Kalyn, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
I asked you to come up with some story ideas, and you have a plethora, and I want to jump right into them. But let me just ask you, how many back-to-schools have you covered now?
I think this is my 10th year doing back to school coverage, but it seems like school is always in session now, so I think of it a little differently.
We were counting up the numbers, and it's incredible to me to think about, but this is the fourth back to school of the pandemic era.
It is kind of unbelievable, I know.
I want to talk about something related to that, and that is the money that the federal government was handing out to states and school districts to help compensate for some of that COVID impact. That's actually one of your big story ideas. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think this is something that, lots of reporters have been watchdogging along the way. But this is kind of the critical school year where the deadline to spend the money is coming up. In most cases, it needs to be spent by fall 2024. So I think this is kind of a critical year that reporters can be looking at what is happening at the school level and at the district level as far as decisions. Are there certain academic recovery programs that are going to fall by the wayside? Are there certain staff positions that have been really crucial to schools over the last several years that may not exist anymore after this school year? So I think this is kind of a good inflection moment where you can kind of be talking to these people and getting a sense for, did these programs work? Were they effective? What did they mean for schools? And what does it mean if they go away? And then I think on the flip side, there's a lot of school districts that have said, we want to keep these things. We want to find ways to keep paying for them because they've been so valuable. I'm thinking a lot about some of the mental health work that we've been seeing. And so schools have to find out another way to pay for them. We've seen states stepping in some cases, and sometimes districts are going to have to make hard choices. So I think that this is my big area of focus for the year.
Well, when I think about this, I think about the fact that federal money generally falls into one of a few different kinds of buckets. And one of the big buckets has always been, this is grassroots money. This is for innovation. This is for something new. And I'm thinking about Race to the Top, the school improvement grants. All of those dollars were intended to ask districts to try something different. And then we have another kind of federal funding, which is sort of the backbone, that extra 5 to 15% of the district budget that's supposed to supplement things that are the core things that students are supposed to get and need, things like special education services. And then there's this last bucket, which is, this is emergency money to help you because there's a crisis and you have a massive hole. And it feels to me with these COVID dollars, people were never really entirely sure where to put the money.
Definitely. We saw really divergent approaches where some people were using them to upgrade buildings that had been in disrepair for 50 years. And you could argue, was that a good use of the money? I think some people would say yes. And then others were, investing in academic interventionists and more school psychologists and more social workers. So whether or not you put this toward kind of a deferred hole in your budget, or you just kind of kept teachers on staff who you might be otherwise would have had to fire, I think that's a really big question. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the school improvement grants. We know from history kind of what happened when that money went away. And a lot of times those funds were invested in kind of shrinking schools that were losing resources and that used the money for what a lot of people would consider kind of just standard investments, like having a social worker. And I think this is a very similar time where some schools spent this money in ways that you would think are kind of basic. And so what does it mean if that money is not there?
What can reporters expect in terms of accountability? There's nothing specific in ESSER that says, tell us how you spent your COVID dollars and what the outcomes were. There certainly has to be an accountability for where the money went, but what about outcomes?
This is something that I think is really interesting that I'd love to see people digging into. On the academic recovery side, I think what you can do is just ask for any kind of efficacy data that the district had, which might just look like attendance data. How many students went to this tutoring? How many students were reached? And do you have any sense for whether or not their attendance, their social emotional factors, if you were measuring those, or any of their state tests changed? I think a lot of districts have told me they're not tracking that. So I think that that's also a story if, districts invested a lot of money and then did nothing to try to see if they worked. On the staffing side, you can definitely request through open records requests the different levels and how they've looked over the last 3 years and how they're about to look this year.
We mentioned special education just now. That's actually one of your other story ideas. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm also really curious to see. We saw a lot of coverage over the last 2 years about how the pandemic completely threw off special education evaluations and services for students. So I think that there's been an expectation that some students might actually have higher needs than they otherwise would have because perhaps they were identified late or they did not receive services early in their school career. So I think now is a great time to dig into the special education data in your district and to see if there's been any big swings up or down in students who are being identified for individualized education plans or for 504 plans. So that might be something that you might actually see a decrease because students weren't being identified, or maybe you'll see an increase. I think that it could really go either way, and that's like an interesting trend to cover on both sides.
I would also encourage reporters to pay close attention to the youngest group, and that, of course, is the 0 to 3 in the preschool for students who may have missed out on early identification simply because they were not in any kind of a group school setting. I've seen some really heartbreaking reporting and also from personal experience and conversations with people about folks that have 2 and 3 year olds who it's their first child, and they simply had no idea that their child was experiencing developmental delays because they just didn't have a frame of reference.
Definitely. I've heard similar stories. And I think also this is a moment where teachers have said that they've been a little bit hesitant to identify students for special education because there might be some kind of lingering emotional, social, or academic effect from the pandemic. So they're trying to be careful not to over identify kids. And so that could also result in kids being under identified. So I think it's really worth digging in to see how is your school and your district approaching this? And are they trying to compensate for the fact that the pandemic might have changed how kids are learning and behaving right now?
When you look up unfunded mandate in the dictionary, there's a nice little hyperlink right there to special education. It's something that's never really gotten as much money as it's entitled to from the feds, and certainly states are already strained. Is there also a story here on what the capacity is at the school and district and state level to help all the kids who are going to need it?
Definitely. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw in the teacher shortage coverage that special education teachers are chronically on the short side list, and that is still true. I think that a lot of school districts are struggling to fill that pipeline. So that kind of instruction side is always really tricky. We saw a huge dip in paraprofessionals. A lot of folks were having really hard time filling the kind of special education teachers aid roles over the last 2 years. So I think you could also argue that a lot of states were and schools were dealing with staffing issues at the same time that they were trying to reach kids. Now, one thing I will point out is that an undercovered area of COVID relief money is that there was extra IDEA money given to schools, particularly to help kids with disabilities during the pandemic. So I think one thing you could do is just ask your school district, how did you spend that extra IDEA money? And what were the things that students with disabilities got because of it? I think that could be a great accountability angle.
There has been a troubling trend of 2 things going hand in hand, and one of them is special ed students, and the other is an increase in suspension rates and discipline issues related to those students, and that's another one of your story ideas, so let's just jump right over into that one.
Yes, over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of coverage around how behavior has changed in schools and how schools have kind of seen an uptick in children acting out, potentially having social or emotional problems, and how they've been responding to that. But when I dug into the data for the 21-22 school year, I saw that districts took really divergent discipline approaches. Some really increased the suspensions, and some didn't at all. So I think it's really worth digging into the district's discipline data this year to see if there's been any notable swings up and down in suspensions and expulsions, students being referred to alternative schools, or even kind of less harsh approaches like in-school suspension, or perhaps new ways that they might be disciplined. The Hechinger report just had a great piece about how schools are relying on virtual, basically suspensions for students, putting kids in a room and teaching them virtually. So I think that those are all things that you can dig into. We've been seeing at some levels approaches where it's become easier to suspend a student. So I also think it's worth digging into the student handbook, the code of conduct for your school district, to see if there's been any changes over the last 2 years. Detroit, for example, one of my colleagues just reported about how they were considering making it easier for principals to suspend kids, giving them more discretion. And we've seen some statewide laws also being considered that would do something similar. So definitely keep in mind any changes that might be made that just kind of make it easier to discipline kids. And what does that mean?
We're talking with Kalyn Belsha of Chalkbeat about big story ideas on the K-12 beat for the coming academic year. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are going to help us grow. Kalyn, you also wanted to talk about the effects of some other new laws in addition to making it easier to suspend students, but some restricting what teachers can talk about in the classroom. Let's dig into that.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of great coverage about how schools are approaching the kind of pushback to critical race theory and pushback to how schools teach about gender and sexuality. But what I would love to see is more kind of drilling down to what does this mean for particular lessons and for particular classes. I think some of the most moving things that I've heard is when I've been able to talk to one teacher or one student about how that law specifically affected one class. So, for example, over the last school year, I spoke with a student in a high school who was able to kind of chronicle for me the difference before and after a law was in place and how that affected their history class. They had been reading some texts that mentioned queer characters, and the teacher actually had an old PowerPoint and they skipped over some slides. So it was a really jarring moment for the student, and it was obvious to them. So I think that looking for more ways that we can kind of make really concrete and plain what the effect of these laws are is really meaningful. I mean, I think we've seen a lot about how teachers think these laws might affect, some of the fear that they've instilled, the way that they've led to books being pulled out of classrooms and libraries. But I think drilling down into the instruction and what students notice is really powerful. And I would love to see more reporting on that.
I think that's a great way to approach it, is to get as many student voices in there as you can. I mean, I'm sure we all have touchdown books from those particular years that were influences on us, and some were signed in class and some were handed to us by an empathetic librarian. Others get passed down from older siblings and friends the way that books do. I really appreciate what you said, though, about looking at what that change will do and what that impact is. And also, I think the limit that we're talking about here, it's not theoretical anymore. I mean, we're talking about having something codified in law, and we're even seeing stories where teachers are facing potential loss of their licenses for violating what people say are the provisions of these laws.
Yeah, now that these laws have been on the books for several years, in some cases, I think that it's a time where we can actually see a lot of the real world effects, that it's not theoretical anymore. And definitely reporting out some of those things, I think, is really important to add to the conversation.
We talked a little bit about early learners, and now I want to move to the other end of the spectrum, and that's high schoolers. Where do you think reporters should be paying closer attention?
I think we've seen pretty good coverage around how graduation was affected, at least early on in the pandemic. We saw some dips and then some kind of stabilizing over the last year. But I've been really interested in how students are kind of moving through high school, especially students whose early part of their high school was really disrupted by the pandemic. Those kids are probably, more like juniors and seniors right now. And are they behind? Are they at risk of not graduating on time? I think that there's a way that you could dig into that is just by asking your school districts, how are they approaching credit recovery right now? Are there more students who are taking credit recovery classes? Are there students who are taking more of those classes because they're behind in multiple subjects? Now, before the pandemic, I think something that a lot of reporters did great work around was looking at credit recovery programs that are primarily online and whether or not that is how we want to teach our high schoolers. It's important for students to graduate, but is it also the best way to make up a class online by kind of zooming through it and not really having a teacher teaching you? Some students didn't get to take classes because they missed a lot of their high school years. They were absent. And so should those be the students that take credit recovery? I think this is a great moment to really dig in and see, what is your district's approach? Are they investing new resources there? Are teachers teaching classes? Or did everyone kind of just go back to the same old online credit recovery and hope that, it worked? I think that there's some really great opportunities there for accountability reporting.
Well, there's a lot of questions to answer. For example, how do graduation rates go up in some places at the same time that people are saying students are leaving school knowing less? So, were state exit exams waived? Were teachers just scaling back expectations for students and passing kids who really weren't ready?
Definitely. I mean, I think we've seen some states changing their policies, and we've also heard from teachers saying that like grades didn't exactly mean what they used to mean in the past. Sometimes, students got multiple opportunities. Some folks were using incompletes and then changing them later. So kind of digging in to see what did that change mean and did that lead to a better graduation rate, I think is a really worthwhile thing to dig into.
I think what you've posed too makes a great crossover story looking at the higher ed piece of this. So, for those of our listeners who are covering both K 12 and higher ed, is looking at the domino effect of this on your state colleges and universities. And I'll give you no specific example. I'm hearing that enrollment rates are in some places at record highs for state universities. And that's having a domino effect on enrollment for the state colleges and the community colleges that would typically get those students who didn't get into their first choice, the state's flagship university. So the fact that they've lowered the bar at some of these state universities and said, before the average student here had a B, now we're going to take a B minus or even a C plus, in part because they need the money, they need the full freight kids, and that is cutting into the enrollment of these schools serving those same students.
Yeah, and I think before the pandemic, there were so many questions around should students who've gotten into a college be required to take remedial courses. And so I also think that in this moment where maybe the bar was lowered to get in, like now is also a good time to think about those classes, which are often classes that are what students would have taken in high school that they maybe didn't get everything they needed.
So we've gone through a bunch of great stories on your list. I've got a few on my short list. Do you want to hear them?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, we're heading into, of course, an election year, 2024. But I would say to education reporters, now's a good time to start listening to who says they're running for school board. Candidates are starting to form committees, filing early campaign finance documents, and they're staking their claims. So I would say check with the registrar and the Secretary of State. Make sure you know the dates for those early filings, for those key races. And then also take a look and compare the number of candidates between this year and prior years and figure out, is it more, is it less, and what impact is this divisive politicized landscape having on candidates?
I love that idea. And I think also when I've seen folks query school board candidates, what I've really loved is when, they've kind of honed in on particular questions. So like, what do you think of the district's academic recovery approach? And trying to get people to be as specific as they can about the actual academics and not just some of the like kind of larger national political questions that sometimes is how a school board race devolves into.
I always had our school board candidates when I was on the local beat. We had them do a questionnaire and we had to do the same questionnaire and we had them do it with us in the office with pen and paper right before their meeting with the editorial board, where they had to write out their answers to our very specific questions. And that had a couple of impacts. One, it was a good quick test to figure out who's sort of dialed into some of the questions about the district. And on the last page, we'd always put in what I thought was a little bit of a sneaky question, but one that any school board candidate should be able to answer. And that is, how many students do we have in this district? And how many teachers are employed? And what is the operating budget of the school system? And people would say to me, oh, it's not fair to try to trick a candidate that way. And I'd say to them, it's basically like going for your driving test and putting your face on the little window to, read the letters through the glass and make sure that you can at least have enough clear vision that you're not going to run anybody down. To me, though, that's just the core minimum.
I love that idea. It kind of reminds me of when folks have asked like a legislator, how much is a bottle of milk? So I think that could totally work. I love that idea.
My other story, and this is a back to school story, and it's about going back to another school, and that's looking at the colleges of education and finding out who are the student teachers assigned to your district this year. There's been a lot of talk about the exodus in the profession. So, who are the ones who are sticking with it, at least in the short term, and have a dream of moving into the classroom despite what I would say has been a pretty tough landscape for educators going back even before the pandemic between budget cuts and everything that's being asked of them. So find out who the student teachers are, find out where they went to school, how prepared they are for some of the big challenges you've already outlined, things like classroom management, things like being able to identify when a student needs help that you may not be able to provide. And then what are the schools of ed doing to supply your districts and how has their instruction changed in the past 4 years?
Yeah, I think that is a great idea. And I think, one big area that we've seen schools of education really responding to law changes has been around the science of reading. So that could also be a really great way to get at, how are schools of education in your area preparing aspiring teachers to teach reading? And is this in line with what your district is doing? That could be a great way to also kind of double down on a second story there.
And then my last story idea for today, though, is taking what's a national story and finding some good ways to localize it. And the Biden administration has said that cybersecurity for schools is a priority. They've had some big meetings and town halls related to this. So I would say a great way to localize that is to look at the job advertisements for your districts as the new school year is starting. How many vacancies do they have for things like data managers and IT? Those are going to be the gatekeepers. Those are going to be the folks who are supposed to be paying attention and preventing things like hacking, and certainly even the ransomware that we've seen, where districts have had to shell out millions of dollars in public funds to retain access to their own records and to protect student privacy. Really, really devastating trend. I would say also paying close attention to the cybersecurity question of what students are sharing about their own personal information. Some states are trying to ban social media platforms such as TikTok, or in other places, raising the participation age to 18. So making sure that schools are talking to students about that as a component of their readiness for the world, of their media literacy.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I think to add on to that, a lot of school districts right now are working with vendors for academic recovery. And so you could also kind of poke at the academic recovery contracts with certain vendors to see what their policies are about retaining information from students, especially if they're using AI or ChatGPT, and where is that information going? I would highly recommend that's a good place to dig in.
For me, the start of the new school year is always going to be the start of the year. Whenever I think about New Year's resolutions, I almost never think about them in January. It's always in September, Kalyn, and that my mind just kind of goes there. Do you have any resolutions for this school year?
I think every year I always say I want to spend more time in classrooms. And this year I'm also lucky enough to be an EWA fellow. So my resolution is to make sure that I publish on time and deliver some really amazing stories through that.
We're very excited about that, and I can say from all of us at WA, we'll be very happy when you publish on time.
Yes.
Kalyn Belsha is a senior reporter for Chalkbeat covering national education issues. She joined us from her office in Chicago. Kalyn, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.